June 1944, Camp Scottsbluff, Nebraska. Though everyone in Nebraska still called it by the older name, Camp Scottsbluff, even when the paperwork said otherwise. The plains were already hot in the way only the American Midwest could be hot, a dry, bright furnace that made the horizon wobble like water. 40 German prisoners of war sat stiff-backed at outdoor tables while cicadas screamed in the cottonwoods behind them. Their eyes moved constantly, scanning for the trap they knew must be coming. Since the day of their surrender, they had carried the same lesson drilled into them by teachers, officers, radio voices. Americans were barbarians, crude victors who respected nothing, and civilization itself ended neatly at Germany's borders. Hans Fischer, 23 years old and trying hard to look older, felt that certainty thrum inside him like a second heartbeat. Whatever was about to happen would prove the Führer right. He was sure of it, the way a man is sure of the ground beneath his chair. Then the farmers arrived in a loose procession from the sugar-beet fields, men in faded overalls and women in summer dresses carrying platters as if this were any ordinary Sunday after church. They set down tin jugs of water, bowls of potato salad, baskets of biscuits. Finally Earl Hutchkins himself appeared with a long tray of grilled corn, each ear charred gold with butter melting in bright rivers. The sight of it struck the Germans like an insult. In their villages corn had always been pig feed, animal fodder stored in barns to fatten livestock before slaughter. Laughter started at the far end of the table, nervous, then bitter, men translating their own humiliation without needing Private Tommy Chen to do it for them. "They feed us like livestock," Klaus said, "just like the Führer promised." Hans joined the laughter because not joining felt like betrayal, yet even as he laughed he watched Earl pick up an ear, bite into it with deliberate pleasure, and lock eyes with Hans. The farmer's chin glistened, and his voice came through Tommy's careful translation. "This is what free men eat." One by one the Germans tasted it, and their faces shifted in ways propaganda had never prepared language for. Surprise first, then something deeper, as if a simple vegetable could pry open sealed rooms inside the chest. 3 weeks into captivity, Hans had already begun to build a routine because routines were safer than thoughts. Wake at dawn, wash at the pump, line up for assignment while guards chose names from clipboards softened by dust. The sugar-beet farms needed labor desperately. Every able-bodied American man was either overseas or bent over machines in factories, and the crops would not wait for politics or for grief. So the prisoners went out in groups of 10, guards watching from truck beds with rifles that pointed more at the idea of trouble than at any particular man. The field stretched wider than anything Hans had ever seen in Germany, green oceans under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The work was backbreaking, the sun merciless, yet there were water breaks, actual breaks, with tin cups passed around and guards who looked almost apologetic about the heat. Hans worked beside Deer, whose real name was Dieter but everyone called him Deer after an early joke, their silence comfortable in the way of men who had shared foxholes and then lost them. The American farmers were cold but fair. They demonstrated what needed doing with gestures instead of screaming, thinning rows, pulling weeds carefully not to damage young plants, then stepped back as if trusting strangers were still possible in wartime. No beatings, no barking dogs, just work hard and honest under the endless Nebraska dome. "They're not what I expected," Klaus said one afternoon, still too young, still believing the war would turn around any day and they would all go home heroes polished clean by victory. Hans corrected him sharply, repeating the old lesson about softness and labor even while he watched a gay-haired farmer built like an ox work the row beside them. The man's hands were as calloused as Hans's father's had been, his back bent the same way. Nothing soft about the exhaustion in that American face when he straightened to drink water. Deer caught Hans looking and said nothing. That was Deer's way, letting a man arrive at uncomfortable truths on his own schedule. By the end of the 3rd week, the work crews had become efficient in spite of armed distance. The Americans learned to demonstrate with 4 fingers instead of shouting 4 inches. The Germans learned which farmers wanted rows thin to exactly Earl's standard and which ones didn't mind 5. There was still little conversation. Language and history stood between them like invisible barbed wire, yet there was rhythm, understanding almost, and then came the first rumor about Earl Hutchkins's farm that made Hans feel something cold settle in his stomach. The camp translator delivered the news during evening roll call, his voice carefully neutral the way medics' voices were neutral before describing wounds. Starting Monday, Group 3 will rotate to the Hutchkins property, and Hans was in Group 3 along with Dieter and Klaus and Kurt Zimmer, the former Gestapo informant's son who spent evenings reminding anyone who would listen that they were still German soldiers, not American pets borrowing mercy like a coat. The muttered conversation among guards, "Earl lost his boy at Normandy," was not quite quiet enough. Hans imagined that father's grief cracking through Geneva Convention civility, imagined spitting, imagined bullets, imagined everything except what Tommy described next. An end-of-summer cookout that Margaret Hutchkins refused to let war change, a tradition 15 years old where American families and German prisoners would sit together under cottonwoods as if shared tables could become new borders. The barracks erupted into nervous laughter and bitter calculation. Kurt Zimmer declared it a trap or humiliation, and Deere offered the mild counter-truth about rules and protocol, yet Hans finally pronounced they would go and eat if they had to without forgetting who they were. The words sounded strong when he said them, resistance shaped like honor, yet that night lying in his bunk Hans felt a hairline crack run through the certainty he had been clutching like armor, because the truth was he did not know what to expect anymore. Sunday evening they marched up the dirt road toward Earl Hutchkins's farm, flanked by 2 guards who looked like they would rather be anywhere else in the universe. The sun was falling, turning everything gold and sentimental the way old photographs were sentimental even before becoming old. Hans saw long wooden tables set up outdoors under a stand of cottonwoods whose branches filtered light onto American clusters, farmers he recognized from the fields with wives and children running between tables, unself-conscious joy from people who had never known war on their own soil. Someone tuned a fiddle near the barn, and the smell, charcoal smoke and roasting meat and something sweet Hans could not identify, struck him like a season arriving late. Margaret Hutchkins emerged from the farmhouse carrying a basket, her face lined with the kind of exhaustion that came from crying privately and smiling publicly. She nodded to prisoners kindly but wary and gestured toward tables. "Please sit eat," Tommy translated, and the Americans clustered opposite them across 10 feet of grass that felt like a minefield invented entirely by imagination. Food arrived in a slow procession of abundance. Fried chicken glistening with grease, potato salad studded with eggs and pickles, biscuit steaming when broken open, thick slices of tomato still warm from the sun. Hans's stomach betrayed him with a low growl because it had been years since he had seen food like this. Not rations, not survival, but careless plenty. Then another prisoner laughed sharply, declaring corn animal feed, and the laughter spread because confirmation felt safer than wonder. Earl Hutchkins stood up so abruptly his chair scraped against packed earth. The yard went silent. Even children stopped running as if rifles had spoken. Earl was a big man, not tall but solid with shoulders grown from decades of work and hands that looked like they could break fence posts. He walked toward the German table while Margaret touched his arm gently pleading Earl, yet Earl picked up an ear of corn, held it for a moment, something flickering across his face, memory or pain too deep for translation, and then he bit into it, butter dripping down his chin. "My son loved this," he said, rough as gravel. "Last thing I cooked before he shipped out. He died in your country's war, and this," Earl held up the corn, juice running down his wrist, "this is what free men eat." He dropped it back on the table, and the sound of it hitting wood echoed like a gunshot invented entirely by conscience. Over the following weeks the corn traveled through Hans's chest like an unwelcome diplomat. The work continued, sugar beets giving way to late-season vegetables, yet now there were small moments cracking through careful distance. An American farmer hummed Mozart of all things while he worked irrigation lines. Klaus showed a picture of his sister to a guard, who answered by revealing a daughter with the same gap-toothed smile. Deer fixed a broken pump, earning a grudging nod of respect from a mechanic who had barely looked at prisoners before. Hans noticed everything and pretended to notice nothing because pretending felt like loyalty. Earl's presence remained constant even when he rarely spoke directly, his face raw with loss when he stared at the far field where the tallest corn grew. It was easier when Americans were monsters, simpler when enemies stayed enemy-shaped without humming Mozart. Late August Wednesday brought heat thick enough to choke on, and Klaus stumbled beside the irrigation line, falling face first into dirt, and did not get up. Hans ran shouting for help while Deer rolled Klaus onto his side, heat stroke written across every symptom, and Earl dropped to his knees, lifting the boy with a gentleness Hans had never imagined possible from men he had once called barbarians. "Get him to shade," Earl barked. "Tommy, call the camp medic now," and Margaret arrived with wet cloths and cellar ice wrapped in towels. Earl pressed ice to Klaus's neck wrists, speaking English the boy could not understand, yet answered anyway because urgency was a universal language. "Stay with me, son," Earl kept saying, "stay with me." And when Klaus finally opened his eyes, delirious, crying "Donkey, thank you" over and over, Earl did not let go until medic protocol replaced rifles. That evening Hans watched Earl step back as if unable to believe he had saved an enemy soldier, called him son. Hans's throat tightened with something he refused to name, lying in his bunk while Klaus recovered. Finally the question emerged without any translator. "Did they lie to us?" Tommy barked. "About everything," Hans asked into darkness that smelled of preserves and of shame, and Deer answered, quiet but certain, "Eat the corn, Hans, it is just corn." But yes, they lied about everything. The idea of a 1,000-year Reich master race war, noble, necessary, right, spun through Hans's mind like a storm arriving early. If corn could be food for free men instead of pigs, if enemies could have Mozart and mercy, then maybe Hans Fischer had spent his whole life believing a story that was never true, and that thought terrified him more than any battlefield. September arrived with a telegram delivered by a Red Cross official whose diplomatic German sounded thin as biscuits gone stale. Hans learned his brother Friedrich, 16 years old, had been killed in an Allied bombing raid on Hamburg. Rage flooded where bridge building had been, and Hans confronted Earl near the equipment shed, accusing "Your people, your bombs murder children," and Earl answered white, then red with fists curled, "Ancient grief. Your people murdered my son." The chasm between them widened again, burned by bombs, bullets, symmetry of loving people the war had taken. Hans refused to leave his bunk for 3 days, clutching Friedrich's photograph, while Deer forced water to his cracked lips. Deer placed a tray with a single ear of grilled corn, saying, "Remembering you are human is not torture, forgetting is," and Hans could not throw it away, though he could not eat it either. At midnight, Earl walked to the camp fence, unable to sleep, having tried scripture dishes, ordinary distractions. His son Joseph's last letter, creased to tearing, lay in his pocket, promising corn and normal life that could never return. On impulse, deeper than impulse, Earl drove home, and returned, leaving at the gate a jar of Margaret's strawberry preserves, Joseph's favorite, with a note written in pencil on a feed bill. "My son was 19. I hate that he is gone. I hate this war, but I do not hate you. That is all I have left to give." Hans read the note 3 times, then a 4th, tears coming before resistance could summon propaganda. He cried for Friedrich, for Joseph, for every boy who had believed lies and died for them, for himself, for the part of him that had died at Normandy and was somehow trying to return to life in a prison camp in Nebraska where planes stayed blue in spite of storms. The weeks that followed moved slowly, the way healing moves slowly even when bones set wrong. Hans returned to work crews under Cottonwood's language barriers, baseball pumps, Mozart humming preserves on Fridays. Earl sometimes allowed Hans to tend the far field without explaining because explanations were heavier than tools. Hans worked that field like sacred ground because it was Joseph's territory, and Earl was letting an enemy soldier choose mercy over hate, 1 row at a time. Other prisoners noticed Hans's harder work and did not laugh at corn anymore. Yet no one declared friendship because declaring felt like crossing Geneva Convention borders prematurely. Still there were small conversations about weather, about irrigation, about daughters' gap-toothed smiles, trains, twanging songs that reminded Hans of German soldiers singing before Normandy, before everything got dark, desperate, wrong. Hans began to understand that captivity itself had seasons, that Geneva Convention civility was not merely paperwork, but Margaret's stubborn tradition, and Earl's gentle hands refusing to let Klaus die, and a note that said, "I do not hate you," when hating would have been easier than biting biscuits. The corn became familiar taste, and Hans sometimes ate it without thinking, only later remembering how he had laughed that first night, and feeling the ghost of shame sit beside him like an invisible guard. Peace no longer felt impossible, though it felt complicated as baseball rules explained entirely by gestures, and as Friedrich's photograph lying in Hans's pocket while he worked Joseph's field under a sky wider than any German border. Autumn winds finally brushed through Nebraska, carrying cooler weather and cooler consciences. American families gathered again for another cookout because traditions outlive telegrams, and the band tuned fiddles while both groups studied each other across grass that no longer felt entirely mined. Hans saw Margaret's lined face and Earl's hollow presence and Dear's mild certainty and Klaus alive and speaking English phrases too fast for loyalty lectures. He understood that the real war lived not only in rage but in grief, asking every man to choose what to plant next, hate or mercy, under skies that did not belong to propaganda. The simple vegetable had indeed shattered a lifetime of lies, yet left in its place a harder story about courage stripped clean, about fathers who could serve corn to enemies and carry children to shade and write notes in pencil at midnight fences. Years later historians would try to describe this moment with headings and with tidy subtopics, yet the men who sat at those tables knew the story contained no headings at all, only paragraphs written by butter dripping down wrists and by ice pressed to necks and by preserves held like glass. Hans Fischer, Nebraska Plains, September 1944, would carry that story home to a Germany learning new seasons of its own. But in June 1944, he was still a prisoner, discovering that civilization might begin not at borders, but at shared tables under cottonwoods, where Mozart sometimes traveled farther than training and truth could move one corn row at a time across storms that might by some miracle pass them by.